Hello everyone, I hope you are very consistent and we all are improving in this journey. So let's begin from where we have left. Long after I had resumed normal life again, that means a long time after my release from camp, somebody showed me an illustrated weekly with photographs of prisoners lying crowded on their bunks, staring dully at a visitor. Isn't it this? Isn't this terrible? The dreadful staring faces, everything about it. Why? I asked. For I genuinely did not understand. For at that moment I saw it all again. At 5 a.m., it was still pitch dark outside. I was lying on the hard boards in an earthen hut where about 70 of us were taken care of. We were sick and did not have to leave camp for war. Camp for work. We did not have to go on parades. We could lie all day in our little corner in the hut and doors and wait for the daily distribution of bread, which of course was reduced for the sick, and for the daily helping of soup, watered down and also decreased in quantity. But how content we were, happy in spite of everything, while we cowered against each other to avoid any unnecessary loss of warmth, and were too lazy and disinterested to move a finger unnecessarily. We heard shrill whistles and shouts from the square where the night shift had just returned and was assembling for roll call. The door was flung open, and the snowstorm blew into our hut. An exhausted comrade, covered with snow, stumbled inside to sit down for a few minutes, but the senior warden turned him out again. It was strictly forbidden to admit a stranger to a hut while a check upon the man was in progress. How sorry I was for that fellow, and how glad not to be in his skin at that moment, but instead to be sick and able to doze on in the sick quarters. What a lifesaver it was to have 2 days there and perhaps even 2 extra days after those one. All this came to my mind when I saw the photographs in the magazine. When I explained, my listeners understood why I did not find the photographs so terrible. The people shown on it might not have been so unhappy after all. On my fourth day in the sick quarters, I had just been retailed to the night shift when the chief doctor rushed in and asked me to volunteer for medical duties in another camp containing typhus patient against the urgent advice of my friends, and despite the fact that almost none of my colleagues offered their services, I decided to volunteer. I knew that in a working part I would die in a short time, but if I had to die, there might at least be some sense in my death. I thought that it would be doubtless be more to the purpose to try and help my comrades as a doctor than to vegetate or finally lose my life as the unproductive laborer I was then. For me, this was simple mathematics, not sacrifice. But secretly, the warrant officer from the sanitation squad had ordered that the two doctors who had volunteered for the typhus camp should be taken care of till they left. We looked so weak that he feared that he might have two additional corpses on his hands rather than two doctors. I mentioned earlier how everything that was not connected with the immediate task of keeping oneself and one's closest friend alive lost its value. Everything was sacrificed to this end. A man's character became involved to the point that he was caught in a mental turmoil which threatened all the values he held and drew them into doubt. Under the influence of a world which no longer recognized the value of human life and human dignity, which had robbed man of his will and had made him an object to be exterminated, Having planned, however, to make full use of him for the last ounce of his physical resources, under this influence, the personal ego finally suffered a loss of values. If the man in the concentration camp did not struggle against this in a last effort to save his self respect, he lost the feeling of being an individual, a being with a mind, with inner freedom and personal value. He thought of himself then as only a part of an enormous mass of people. His existence descended to the level of animal life. The men were herded, sometimes to one place, then to another, sometimes driven together, then apart, like a flock of sheep without a thought or a will of their own. A small but dangerous pack watched them from all sides. Well, first in methods of torture and sadism, they drove the herd incessantly backwards and forwards with shouts, kicks, and blows. And we, the ship, thought of two things only: how to evade the bad dogs and how to get a little food. Just like sheep that crowd timidly into the center of a herd, each of us tried to get into the middle of our formations. That gave one a better chance of avoiding the blows of the guards who were marching on either side and to the front and rear of our column. The central position uh, had the added advantage of affording protection against the bitter winds. It was therefore in an attempt to save one's own skin that one literally tried to submerge into the crowd. This was done automatically in the formations, but at other times it was a very conscious effort on our part in conformity with one of the camp's most imperative laws of self preservation. Do not be conspicuous. We tried at all times to avoid attracting the attention of the SS. There were times, of course, when it was possible and even necessary to keep away from the crowd. It is well known that an enforced community life in which attention is paid to everything one does at all times may result in an irresistible urge to get away, at least for a short while. The prisoner craved to be alone with himself and his thoughts. He yearned for privacy and for solitude. After my transportation to a so-called rest camp, I had the rare fortune to find solitude for about 5 minutes at a time behind the earthen hut where I worked and in which were crowded about 50 delirious patients. There was a quiet spot in a corner of the double fence of barbed wire surrounding the camp. A tent had been improvised there with a few poles and branches of trees in order to shelter a half-dozen corpses. The daily death rate in the camp. There was also a shaft leading to the water pipes. I squatted on the wooden lid of the shop whenever my services were not needed. I just sat and looked out at the garden flowering slopes and the distant blue hills of the Bavarian landscape, framed by the meshes of barbed wire. I dreamed longingly, and my thoughts wandered north and northeast in the direction of my home, but I could only see clouds. The corpses near me, crawling with lice, did not bother me. Only the steps of passing guards could rouse me from my dreams. Or perhaps it would be a call to the sick bay or to collect a newly arrived supply of medicine for my heart, consisting of perhaps 5 or 10 tablets of aspirin to last for several days for 50 patients. I collected them and then did my rounds, feeling the patient's pulses and giving half tablets to the serious cases. But the desperately ill received no medicine. It would not have helped, and besides, it would have deprived those for whom there was still some hope. For light cases, I had nothing, except perhaps a word of encouragement. In this way, I dragged myself from patient to patient. Though I myself was weak and exhausted from a serious attack of typhus, then I went back to my lonely place on the wood cover of the water shaft. This shaft, incidentally, once saved the lives of 3 fellow prisoners. Shortly before liberation, mass transports were organized to go to Tegucigalpa, and these three prisoners wisely tried to avoid the trip. They climbed down the shaft and hid there from the guards. I calmly sat on the lid, looking innocent and playing the childish game of throwing pebbles at the barbed wire. On spotting me, the guard hesitated for a moment, but then passed on. Soon I could tell the three men below that the worst danger was over. It is very difficult for an outsider to grasp how very little value was placed on human life in camp. The inmate was hardened, but possibly became more conscious of this complete disregard of human existence when a convoy of sick men was arranged. The emaciated bodies of the sick were thrown on two-wheeled carts, which were drawn by prisoners for many miles, often through snowstorms to the next camp. If one of the sick men had died before the cart left, he was thrown on anyway. The list had to be corrected. I corrected I. The list was the only thing that mattered. A man counted only because he had a prison number. One literally became a number, dead or alive. That was unimportant. The life of a number was completely irrelevant. What stood behind that number and that life mattered even less. The fate, the history, the name of the man in the transport of sick patients that I, in my capacity as a doctor, had to accompany from one camp in Bavaria to another. There was a young prisoner whose brother was not on the list and therefore would have to be left behind. The young man begged so long that the camp warden decided to work an exchange, and the brother took the place of a man who, at the moment, preferred to stay behind. But the list had to be correct. That was easy. The brother just exchanged numbers with the other prisoner. As I have mentioned before, we had no documents. Everyone was lucky to own his body, which, after all, was still breathing. All else about us, that is, the rags hanging from our gaunt skeletons, was only of interest if we were assigned to a transport of sick patients. The departing Moslems were examined with unabashed curiosity to see whether their coats or shoes were not better than one's own. After all, their fates were sealed, but those who stayed behind in camp, who were still capable of some work, had to make use of every means to improve their chances of survival. They were not sentimental. The prisoners saw themselves completely dependent on the moods of the guard, playthings of fate, and this made them even less human than the circumstances warranted. In Auschwitz, I had laid down a rule for myself, which proved to be a good one, and one which most of the comrades later followed. I generally answered all kinds of questions truthfully, but I was silent about anything that was not expressly asked for. If I were asked my age, I gave it. If asked about my profession, I said doctor, but did not elaborate. The first morning in Auschwitz, an SS officer came to the parade ground. We had to fall into separate groups of prisoners, over 40 years, under 40 years, metal workers, mechanics, and so forth. Then we were examined for ruptures, and some prisoners had to form a new group. The group that I was in was driven to another hut, where we lined up again. After being sorted out once more and having answered questions as to my age and profession, I was sent to another small group. Once more we were driven to another hut and grouped differently. This continued for some time and I became quite unhappy, finding myself among strangers who spoke unintelligible foreign languages. Then came the last selection, and I found myself back in the group that had been with me in the first herd. They had barely noticed that I had been sent from hut to hut in the meantime, but I was aware that in those few minutes fate had passed me in many different forms. When the transport of sick patients for the rest camp was organized, my name, that is, my number, was put on the list since a few doctors were needed, but no one was convinced that the destination was really a rest camp. A few weeks previously, the same transport had been prepared. Then, too, everyone had thought that it was destined for the gas ovens. When it was announced that anyone who volunteered for the dreaded night shift would be taken off the transport list, 82 prisoners volunteered immediately. A quarter of an hour later, the transport was cancelled, but the 82 stayed on the list for the night shift. For the majority of them, this meant death within the next fortnight. Now, the transport for the rest camp was arranged for the second time. Again, no one knew whether this was a ruse to obtain the last bit of work from the sick, if only for 14 days, or whether it would go to the gas ovens or to a genuine rest camp. The chief doctor, who had taken a liking to me, told me furtively one evening at a quarter to 10, I have made it known in the orderly room that you can still have your name crossed off the list. You may do so up till 10 o'clock. I told him that this was not my way, that I had learned to let fate take its course. I might as well stay with my friends, I said. There was a look of pity in his eyes, as if he knew. He shook my hand silently, as though it were a farewell, not for life, but from life. Slowly I walked away. I walked back to my heart. There I found a good friend waiting for me. You really want to go with them? He asked sadly. Yes, I'm going. Tears came to his eyes, and I tried to comfort him. Then there was something else to do, to make my will. Listen, Otto, if I don't get back home to my wife, and if you should see her again, then tell her that I talked of her daily, hourly. You remember. Secondly, I have loved her more than anyone. Thirdly, the short time I have been married to her outweighs everything, even all we have gone through here. Otto, where are you now? Are you alive? What has happened to you since our last start together? Did you find your wife again? And do you remember how I made you learn my will by heart, word for word, in spite of your childlike tears? The next morning I departed with the transport. This time it was not a ruse. We were not heading for the gas chambers, and we actually did not do a rest camp, did not go to a rest fund. Those who had pitied me remained in a camp where famine was to rage even more fiercely than in our new camp. They tried to save themselves, but they only sealed their own fates. Months later, after liberation, I met a friend from the old camp. He related to me how he, as camp policeman, had searched for a piece of human flesh that was missing from a pile of corpses. He confiscated it from a pot in which he found it cooking. Cannibalism had broken out. I had left just in time. Does this not bring to mind the story of death in Tehran? A rich and mighty Persian once walked in his garden with one of his servants. The servant cried and that he had just encountered death. Who had threatened him. He begged his master to give him his fastest horse so that he could make haste and flee to Tehran, which he could reach that same evening. The master consented, and the servant galloped off on the horse. On returning to his house, the master himself met death and questioned him. Why did you terrify and threaten my servant? I did not threaten him. I only showed surprise in still finding him here when I planned to meet him tonight in Tehran, said death. The camp inmate was frightened of making decisions and of taking any sort of initiative whatsoever. This was the result of a strong feeling that fate was one's master, and that one must not try to influence it in any way, but instead let it take its own course. In addition, there was a great apathy, which contributed in no small part to the feelings of the prisoners. At times, lighting decisions had to be made, decisions which spelled life or death. The prisoner would have preferred to let fate make the choice for him. This escape from commitment was most apparent when a prisoner had to make the decision for or against the escape attempt. In those minutes in which he had to make up his mind, and it was always a question of minutes, he suffered the tortures of hell. Should he make the attempt to flee? Should he take the risk? I too experienced this torment as the battlefront drew nearer. I had the opportunity to escape. A colleague of mine who had to visit huts outside the camp in the course of his medical duties wanted to escape and take me with him. Under the pretense of holding a consultation about a patient whose illness required a specialist advice, he smuggled me out. Outside the camp, a member of a foreign resistance movement was to supply us with uniforms and documents. At the last moment, there were some technical difficulties, and we had to return to camp once more. We used this opportunity to provide ourselves with provisions, a few rotten potatoes, and to look for a rucksack. We broke into an empty hut of the women's camp, which was vacant, as the women had been sent to another camp. The hut was in great disorder. It was obvious that many women had acquired supplies and fled. There were rags, straw, rotting food, and broken crockery. Some bowls were still in good condition and would have been very valuable to us, but we decided not to take them. We knew that lately, as conditions had become desperate, they had been used not only for food but also as wash basins and chamber posts. There was a strictly enforced rule against having a kind of utensils in the hut. However, some people were forced to break this rule, especially the typhus patients, who were much too weak to go outside even with their help. While I acted as a screen, my friend broke into the hut and returned shortly with a rucksack which he hid under his coat. He had seen another one inside which I was to take. So we changed places and I went in. As I searched in the rubbish, finding the rucksack and even a toothbrush, I suddenly saw among all things that had been left behind the body of a woman. So, guys, this is really interesting, but we will continue it in the next video. Thank you, and we'll see you soon.